Let's talk about Canada's 9% rule. And totally not a Canadian whiskey. I did this on purpose, but it is a little ironic to be drinking a non-Canadian whiskey while talking about Canada's 9.09% rule. Super nerdy topic. Before I start, I'm Daniel Whittington, Chancellor of Wizard Academy and Whiskey Marketing School, and my two places that I got a lot of really great information to talk to you about this video, I'm going to say it up front, were whiskey.muse.com and Davin DeCurgamo, who's really the encyclopedia of Canadian whiskey information, right? He's the go-to. And if I'm not mistaken, Whiskey Muse actually talked with Davin for her article. But anyway, those are really great, well-written resources on whiskey. So, man, this is weird. Okay. Did you know that Canada has a whiskey rule called the 9% or the 9.09% rule? And what it is it's legislation in Canada that allows a whiskey producer to add up to 9.09% non-Canadian whiskey to a product and still release it as Canadian whiskey. Now, does that mean all Canadian whiskey has flavoring and bullshit and they just mix things in and they put no, absolutely not. There are very real restrictions around what counts as what can be added. It can't just be sugar bombs, and it can't just be a glug of maple syrup, and it can't just be 9% food coloring, which, by the way, would be insane. It would look as black as tar. That'd be absolutely ridiculous. It doesn't mean sugar water, right? There is a category, and the rule is, and I'm going to read it so I can get it exactly right, any spirit or wine, domestic or imported. Spirit or wine, domestic or imported. And if you want to import a spirit, it has to be at least 2 years old, aged, right? Now, that eliminates just pure wine. You say wine, but what we really mean are barrel-aged wines. And usually what they mean is barrel-aged, like fortified type things, like sherry or port, maybe Madeira, right? It's not just like someone grabs a bottle of Cab and dumps it into a thing of whiskey and calls it done. That's not how that works, right? So, you can add, however, bourbon, American bourbon, or rye, American rye, or you could add French cognac. You can't add vodka or tequila. Actually, you could add tequila if it was at least 2 years old, but that's pretty dang rare, a 2-year-old aged tequila. Anyway, so anything younger than añejo and a 2-year-old añejo, even then, yeah. So you couldn't do Blanco or Reposado. You can't do gin. You can't do maple syrup, right? So there are a lot of restrictions around this flavoring. Now, it's given some producers have played a little soft and loose with this rule, and it's given people a bad name. Or brands a bad name, because you can also do caramel coloring or light flavoring. But I'm telling you, no one's going to add 9% flavoring to a whiskey and still call it flavor. You'll taste the flavor. That's a lot. 9% sounds low. It's not low when you're mixing things together. What it is most often used for, and actually I'll tell you the origin of it, but first we're going to drink Basil Hayden, and then maybe you're going to understand why I'm talking about this. This is the Basil Hayden Dark Rye, and this is their newer release of it. I was going to review this because of this conversation, and I went to the vault, and it was the original Dark Rye bottle, which doesn't look anything like this, and I realized, man, it used to be that I could pull a bottle from the vault and do a review. The vault is now old enough that I will regularly pull a bottle from the vault to do a review and discover that I'm about 5 years behind the design curve on the modern releases. But we just don't drink, there's so much whiskey in there, we don't go through it as fast. So this technically falls, like I store this in the rye section in the vault, but it's not legally a rye. That's why it's called dark rye, which is considered, according to American rules, a fanciful title. And then underneath, you have what is probably the distilled spirit specialty ruling for it. So what is dark rye defined as, according to TTB? It is defined as, down here, Kentucky straight rye whiskey blended with Canadian rye whiskey and port. That's why we're talking about this 9.09% rule. So this is a Kentucky rye, Basil Hayden, Kentucky rye blended with Canadian rye and port wine. Now, on the nose. Ooh, it smells more rye than anything else. There is a candied sweetness to it, but it's behind the rye grain. Oh, no, it's opening up a little bit. Now I'm getting, if you did mix a hard candy cherry lozenge with a whole bunch of herbal rye notes, but it's still sweet. It's very tight, and cherry is the right word. It's very tight and held together, berry and grain. I'm having a hard time cracking it, so I'm gonna add a little water in a second. First, let's try a sip. Oh, there's the sweetness. In the palate, this is just candy with some baking spices. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cherry cordial, a dryness of oak tannin. Whew. And like a dry rye bread almost. Ooh, wow, that's real dry. Okay. Add a little water to that. We'll let that sit for a second. So, why did this rule come into part? Here's the irony. So we teach in whiskey school that all of the changes and innovation in whiskey history either come because of farmers doing something efficiently, taxes, or the government. That's it. All the major changes in whiskey history, farmers, taxes, government intervention. That's it. Very rarely, or if ever, was it someone working their butts off to really refine something and then it became the law of the land. Now, sometimes the government adopted things that people had done. Like you could argue that the bottled and bond and a whole lot of Colonel Taylor, E.H. Taylor's experiments in bourbon essentially got brought into whiskey legislation, including like minimum proof and minimum distillation levels and or maximum distillation levels. But anyway, that's really nerdy. So the 9.09% Canadian rule comes from the era when U.S. was passing huge tariffs on imported products. But if you included American products in your imported product, you avoided the tariff. And 9.09% of American bourbon mixed into Canadian whiskey allowed them to import Canadian whiskey into the US and not pay the tariff. And so they made a rule that you could still call it Canadian whiskey even if you used a little bit of those American stuff in it. So that you could still avoid the tariffs and sell stuff in the US. Absolutely hilarious. But it also included wine, so you could also do cognac. Now, when you're finishing whiskey, which we talked about a few episodes ago, when you're finishing whiskeys, sometimes you'll get these barrels and from a sherry producer or from a cognac producer, and you'll go open the bung and be like, woo, there's still a little liquid in there. And it is not uncommon for the, less picky of distillers to just pour their whiskey right into that. And now you end up with what technically should have been reported as a bourbon blended with sherry, but it was really just an empty cask, right? So all Canada is doing is saying, hey, that's fine. That's part of the 9% rule. You can have a little sherry in there. It's very rare that someone takes a vat of whiskey and then takes a sherry and dumps it into the vat according to the 9% rule. What is more often happening is sloppy barrel fills and things like that. Now, in defense of the 9.09%, they don't allow any vodka. You can't do any unaged spirit in that 9% rule. But an American blended whiskey, guess what you can use? Up to 80% vodka. So, who loses that budget war? Definitely Americans. Okay. With a little bit of water, the cinnamon roll and super ginger spice notes kind of jumped out, and the cherry sweetness subsided. Hey, and there, a drier palate. With a little water, I like it way better. It's less candy. It's a little more vibrant. The overly sugared notes kind of subside and you get a little bit more of the dryness, but the dryness isn't overwhelming and too astringent. It's fine. Would I crave it? No. Do I enjoy it? Yeah, absolutely. Some import for me, that's enjoyable. Now, the next thing I'm about to say, I have zero proof, zero knowledge, and could be 1,000% wrong. But I wonder, because the Canadian whiskey in this whiskey is Alberta. One of the few Canadian distilleries making 100% rye whiskey. I wonder if the reason you ended up with them having to say port is because it was Alberta product that was following the Canadian rule and had some port in it. And then when they blended it with their Kentucky rye, the American rule forced them to disclose both the Canadian whiskey and the port ingredient, as opposed to them just sitting around with a bottle of bourbon or rye, a bottle of Canadian Alberta, and a bottle of port and blending to proportions. Just wondering. I hope that was helpful. Now you know about Canada's rule, and you know that it's not just an excuse to add syrup into whiskey. Cheers to you, and I'm really glad you're here. If you like this video, at least 9.09%, you should like and subscribe.